いのでもそんなんじゃダメもうそんなんじゃほら心は進化するよもっともっと
Hey guys, so funny story, this initially wasn't going to be a full review, just like my first impressions of the game and everything, but then I got really into it and I finished it, so here we are. Here's what I'm going to be grading it on, and let's just jump right in. Cuphead follows the adventures of the titular protagonist and his best friend, Mugman. Now, Cuphead and Mugman got themselves into a bit of trouble by going out and gambling at a casino run by the literal fucking devil. They were on a bit of a hot streak, winning dice roll after dice roll, when Satan himself decides to offer them a challenge. They roll one more time, and if they lose, he gets their souls. Mugman thinks it's a pretty bad idea, but Cuphead, being the greedy little shit he is, decides to roll and subsequently loses. Now scared at the thought of eternal damnation, Cuphead and Mugman try to bargain with the devil and say that they'll do anything to keep their souls. The devil then decides that he can make some use of them, and decides to send them out to take the souls of other creatures of the island that are indebted to him. Now, the story here isn't going to win any Pulitzer Prizes or anything, but truthfully the story is all it needs to be in order to get the game rolling. You know damn well going into Cuphead that you're not going to get a 60-hour epic a la Final Fantasy. Here's the little cup guy, finger-blasting woodland creatures. And honestly, the fact that the story is just a little setup really adds the whole motif that Studio MDHR was going for with the 30s cartoon style. None of them really had much story and was more about visual comedy rather than telling elaborate jokes. I think seeing as it does well to set up the game, is still pretty creative, and gives you good enough motivation to play the game, Cuphead gets about an 8 out of 10 in the story department. It's nothing super spectacular, but it's enough to be pretty neat, all things considered. Oh boy, here's the big section of this review. Well, this one and probably graphics. Anyway, Cuphead is a run-and-gun shooter, very much in the vein of games like Contra, Metal Slug, and Gunstar Heroes. In essence, you run to the right and you shoot shit. Simple enough concept, but Cuphead shines with just how well it's pulled off. The controls feel tight and very responsive, controlling Cuphead is awesome and smooth as hell, and the game mechanics are very easy to learn but tough to master, and believe me, you do have to master the controls in order to beat the game. The game is divided between two types of levels, run-and-gun platform stages and boss fights, with boss fights being the majority of the game. Now, if you're not a huge fan of just fighting bosses and would rather play just run-and-gun stages, then Cuphead may not be for you. That being said, however, these bosses are quite possibly some of the most well-designed bosses I've seen in video games in a quite long time. Each boss is incredibly unique and every one presents a completely new challenge from the last. Every boss typically consists of 3 phases, undergoing some kind of transformation as you do enough damage to push it into the next phase. Each phase of the boss is completely unique, and although they undergo pretty crazy transformations in some cases, each boss retains its initial identity and theme, which is really a testament to the amount of time and creativity that went into making this game. Now, I do want to make sure I say this at some point, and while talking about the bosses seems to be the perfect place. This game will unapologetically beat your ass. Cuphead is a very, very difficult game. But in saying that, it is hardly ever unfair. As I said before, each boss presents a completely new challenge for you, and each boss goes through a few phases, each becoming increasingly harder and adding new elements to the fight. I honestly don't think that it's possible to beat any boss other than the very first on your first try. Cuphead is a game that requires a lot of trial and error and a lot of learning. Each boss has very defined patterns for each phase that you need to learn how to get through safely in order to be successful. Sometimes, in later levels especially, you'll really need to have your parry and dash mechanics down in order to save yourself from being hit, because unless you buy extra health from the shop, you can only get hit 3 times before death. Now, I have heard some people say that some of Cuphead's difficulty can be attributed to the patterns of certain bosses being randomized at some points, like the genie for example, but honestly, I don't think it's really that bad. Yeah, sure, some bosses do have options for the attacks that they can use in certain phases, but really that's just a part of the pattern for that phase. There is no secret for beating Cuphead other than to just practice. You will not just get lucky and find a special weak spot, and you won't be able to exploit some cheesy boss weakness in order to prevail. Succeeding in this game is really just about practicing and learning how the bosses work so that you can defeat them, and boy is it satisfying when you do. Trust me, I'm a huge bitch when playing tough games, but Cuphead never felt discouraging for me, and I always wanted to keep trying in order to prevail over my enemy. Every death was my fault. Every try I got a bit closer. A great addition to the game that helps foster the just one more try mentality is the progress bar that comes up whenever you die. With this, you can see just how close you were either to the end of the stage in the run and gun levels, or how much damage you did to the boss. It's a very small addition, but it's great for tracking your progress and making you think, well, if I just try one more time, I can beat it, especially when you see that you got really close to the end. Now, I know I've talked a lot about the bosses, and that's understandable since they make up a good 75% of the game, but the run and gun stages are also pretty neat as well. They're also pretty difficult, with later stages needing you to reverse gravity and pull off some pretty insane jump, dash, parry combos in order to get through. Honestly though, there isn't a ton I can say about them, seeing as there's only 6 in the whole game. Their main purpose is just to get you coins that you can spend in the in-game shop to unlock upgrades and new weapon types. All the weapon types are pretty neat and each have their own uses, but honestly, I got through the entire game using the boomerang shot. I found it to be the best fit for my playstyle, as it allowed me to dodge and run away from bosses while also being able to put out damage at a pretty decent rate. The nice thing about the weapon options is that there really isn't one weapon that's overall better than any other. Each one has its own strengths and weaknesses, and it's really up to you to figure out which weapon fits you best. Like I mentioned before, you can also purchase upgrades in the shop in order to give you some kind of boost to one area of your skills with drawbacks in another. The one that I used throughout the whole game was the extra health power-up, and if you're bad at video games like me, I highly recommend it. It does lower your damage output a bit, but boy, that one extra hit point comes in handy a ton. The final kind of upgrade you can get comes in the form of your super abilities, which you receive after saving the legendary chalice from spooky ghosts in the mausoleums found in each area. There are 3 altogether, and each one is pretty useful in their own way. The one I relied on most was the big-ass laser beam, because I found that it really helped me get through annoying boss phases super quickly, and also came in handy if I wasn't going to be able to dodge something, since it makes you invisible while you're using it. Now, I know I've talked a lot about the gameplay, but there's just a lot here, and the one final aspect of the gameplay I have to talk about is the plane sections. If there's anything about the gameplay that I really didn't like, it was definitely the bosses that I had to fight in the plane. Now, it's not bad to control and has a neat tutorial, but it felt like my mobility options were way more limited, and the bosses you had to fight with it took a lot more precision than some of the others. Now, I mean, this could just be because of my playstyle, but holy shit, some of these sections were hard. Fuck the genie and fuck the robot the most. I probably spent an hour on each of them, and the whole game took me like 6 hours total. Plane sections aside, I honestly think I have to give Cuphead a 10 out of 10 on the gameplay front. It was so incredibly fun, even though at points it was very infuriating. It's kind of like if slamming your head against a wall came with like a candy prize. Very hard and painful, but still pretty nice. Quite possibly the most striking thing about Cuphead is the visuals. From even just looking at screenshots of the game, it looks like it was ripped straight out of a 1930s cartoon and just colorized. To anyone even a little bit familiar with the world of animation, it's really easy to tell that Cuphead was heavily inspired by the works of Max Fleischer as well as early Disney works. I'm not even going to try to beat around the bush on it. The animation in this game is beautiful. They nailed every aspect of the art style, even down to the little details like the crackly old film filter they put over everything. Everything was hand-drawn and animated first, then transferred to digital animation, and it all just works so well. All of the character animations are incredibly smooth and natural, and the characters themselves are incredibly expressive without ever even having to say a single word. One especially interesting thing about the animation is actually related to the frame rate of the game. Now, back in the 30s when things were being animated, it was typically done at about 24 frames per second. Cuphead, on the other hand, runs at 60 frames per second, which is pretty wild, especially the amount of work that you would have to do to get it to run at 60 frames per second, like constantly doing hand-drawn animation. Like I said before, all the bosses are extremely well designed and incredibly unique, all the way down to the designs for the individual stages of each fight. No matter how aggravating a boss was, I was still always able to look at the design of it and just be like, oh, that's pretty neat. It's really not hard to tell that a lot of love went into animating this game, and I honestly hope that more games embrace traditional animation for their art styles rather than going the pixel route to look retro. I could go on gushing about how nice this game looks, but just look at the footage that's been playing throughout the video. It's so goddamn beautiful. Cuphead gets a 10 out of 10 on graphics.
You like jazz?
Because if so, you'll love Cuphead's soundtrack. It's a completely original jazzy soundtrack, but with a lot of different styles mixed in depending on the different locales you visit. You might have heard it playing in the background this whole time, but here's a few clips of the soundtrack uninterrupted so you can appreciate just how much went into it. Of course, in keeping with the 30s aesthetic, the jazz soundtrack was an awesome addition, and I think the dude who composed this and the people who recorded the instruments all deserve all the praise in the world. I'm not even that big of a jazz fan, but I'm still finding myself legitimately sitting and listening to the soundtrack for extended periods of time when I'm doing something. It's just that good. In addition to the soundtrack, Cuphead's sound effects are great as well. Everything has an incredibly cheesy, cartoony kind of sound that makes all the action just pop, and again, adds to the overall style of the game. In the sound department, Cuphead gets a definite 10 out of 10. Cuphead is kind of an interesting case for grading on replayability. Since the bosses and levels are so challenging, chances are you'll be playing them over and over again anyway, just to be able to beat them. But, thanks to the rating system that tracks your performance at the end of each level, real completionists and complete masochists can try over and over to get that A+ rating for every level. And if that wasn't enough, there's also a special expert mode that unlocks after you beat the game. I can definitely say that I'll never try it, but I can assume that shit gets wild from there. The extra mode is nice though, and the ratings do add at least a little bit of incentive to play levels over and over again, so for replayability, Cuphead gets like a 6 out of 10. After tallying up the results, Cuphead gets an 88 out of 100 or a B+. I really did want to give this game an A, but honestly the fact that you only have minimal reason to play through it again kinda brought it down. I can see if you want to collect all the achievements and also get bragging rights that you were able to conquer hard mode, but it just doesn't really seem worth it in the grand scheme of things. That being said, Cuphead is a game that I absolutely recommend, even if you aren't a fan of run and gun games or games that are super hard. If you like animation or cartoons, it's honestly just like stepping into an old cartoon and having a blast. Every single thing in the game works towards capturing that style, and boy does it pay off. It's fun, it's incredibly creative, it looks good, it sounds good, and overall is just a great experience. And with expansion packs rumored to be releasing in the future containing 10 to 15 new bosses apiece, it's a great time to pick it up and start honing your skills now. Thanks for watching, and have an awesome day.
Mr. King Dice.